Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have another terrifying lineup of encounters to share with you. Before we get into those, though, a couple links I'd like to share. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch store to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Those links are in the description below. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Today's first encounter. We live out in the boonies along a bayou in southern Louisiana. Back in September 21st of 2010, about 8:30 p.m., our daughter had been asleep for roughly 30 minutes. My wife and I heard tapping from the front of the house on a window. The sound was howl sounding because the windows are double paned to help with insulation. The tapping was rhythmic and was heard 4 times. My wife and I looked at each other like, what was that? Did you hear it? We have motion sensors around our house, and not one was tripped. Our little dog was on the couch with us, but was sound asleep and didn't hear a thing. We live in a new house in an old pasture surrounded by hog wire with a single strand of barbed wire 5 foot tall, with the northern part of the house 25 yards from the woods, which runs into a swamp. In a matter of seconds, I was out the front door of my house with my .45 and a 3 million candle power light. My wife bolted the door and stood guard inside. The night was warm and clear. Once outside, the motion lights activated as my presence tripped them. I began to sweep around the house. I moved to the north, and my movement spooked something in the thick brush. From the sound of it, it was a deer. Doe with fawns and yearling like to sleep close to the house, as nothing will bother them, at least until hunting season. But I didn't have eyes on them. The sweep continued around the house, with each sector of motion lights kicking on in turn. Nothing was observed, nor any tracks noticed that night, or during the following day. The fence showed no signs of being climbed or evidence of being crawled under. My in-laws were notified as they only live 100 yards away from us. Now, I'm a combat vet and I don't spook easily. I've seen many things in this world, but this set me at condition 1, as the noise had to have come from my daughter's room's window. My wife checked, she was sound asleep. Later that weekend, I made a sweep through the swamp with no visuals or anything to alert me to lie in wait that night. This was spooky, and I waited for this event to happen again. Extra precautions had been taken. But we never had another experience ever again. Very strange. Now, I shared this encounter because some are going to be like, well, that wasn't a dog, man. No one saw it. Well, think of where they were. Louisiana, close to the swamp. Rougarou country. And I had an interview with a subscriber back a little over a year ago. He actually sent me a gator head. And his family were plagued by the Rougarou or Dogman. His mother saw a black mist one day as he was walking out to his home. His home was behind his parents' home. He had seen countless dogmen or Rougarou. Now, the Rougarou is Cajun lore. Looks like a dogman. But it also supposedly is a shapeshifter. It can change to a black, smoky mist, dogman-like creature, gator-like creature. And when I read this encounter, I instantly thought of that subscriber who shared his experiences with me and you guys, because he was on the show once. So I'm thinking it was the Rougarou. Maybe mist-like, while tapping to get the child's attention, to lure it outside. Then when the father came out, transformed into a beast again, and simply jumped the fence with ease. Who knows? I wasn't there, nor were you. But we cannot dismiss it. Moving on. Today's second encounter comes to us from eastern Pennsylvania. Late summer of '75, my cooking of dinner was suddenly interrupted by someone pounding frantically on my front door, screaming my name at the top of their lungs. My husband, who was in the basement at the time, started shouting, "What's all the ruckus about?" Before I could answer him, I was already going to the door, seeing my neighbor Tina through the windows. I turned the knob, and Tina was in such a state that she almost fell into the house instead of walking in. At that very same moment, my husband had come up the stairs and was entering the living room. Tina began ranting about a huge black bear walking next to her outbuilding. She was in such a state of shock. Immediately, I sat her down, as my husband wasted no time getting his shotgun. 2 minutes later, my husband told us to stay inside, and out the door he went. Tina was shouting, "Please be careful," but Mike was already outside. I stayed with her, trying to calm her down and console her, when literally minutes later 2 shots rang out and we ran to the window. We went from one window to the next looking for my husband, and then the front door came crashing open, with Mike coming in with his gun, looking like he had seen a ghost. I said to him, "What's wrong? Did you see it?" Mike looked at us and said, "That's no bear, it's a monster." Tina looked at me, and me at her, as I said, "What are you talking about?" Mike said he saw what he thought was a black bear walking on all fours along the fence line in Tina's yard, next to the outbuilding, sneaking up on the corner of the building. He leaned his shotgun on the siding and fired both barrels at the creature, hitting it cleanly with both rounds, or so he says. He went on to say that the bear, or what he thought was a bear, leaped up and turned in one quick movement, and now, standing on 2 legs, began to run towards him across the yard. Having no more shells with him, he found himself turned and hightailing it back to the house, which is why he came crashing through the door. He said he came home to get more shells, and for us to go lock ourselves in the back room, and not to come out until he told us it was okay. I could hear one of the back windows being forced open, which were stuck shut from painting, and this was followed by 2 more gunshots which rang through the house, filling the room with the smell of gunpowder. The next thing I knew, I was hearing the sound of the telephone dial ratcheting back and forth, which, followed by Mike calling the police to come over right away. We waited for about 10 minutes until the first officer arrived. Moments later, the second pulled into the drive as Mike and the first officer were already talking things over in the driveway. This is when I first heard them say it was huge, gorilla-type monster and not a bear. Up until that point, Mike hadn't explained to us all that had transpired. I guess he didn't want to frighten us. Tina and I now watched from various windows in the house as best as we could, as Mike and the 2 police officers made their way cautiously into the yard behind her house. We suddenly heard one of the officers shout, "Look out!" After which 3 shots were fired from what sounded like one of the officers' revolvers. It was almost 20 minutes later that all 3 men made their way back to the house and came inside. Tina and I were literally on pins and needles, not knowing or seeing anything in regards to why the shots had been fired, and at what. As the conversation unraveled, this gorilla had darted from one side of the yard to the other, as the two officers and Mike split up, walking along both sides of the outbuilding. According to the conversations, the police were calling it a Bigfoot and described it as being 7 feet tall and running very quickly on two legs. Apparently, Mike thought it better to not tell us that it was a Bigfoot and not a bear when he had seen it. But the truth came out in the end. The police had openly said that reports of these creatures had been investigated throughout the years within the state, but this was the first time that one, as far as they knew, had actually been seen and shot at by officers. 20 minutes later, our yards were crawling with police and canines running out into the property, picking up the scent of this creature virtually immediately. The police and 2 dogs were in the woods for a good hour or so before coming back. Another officer had found some footprints along the fence line, which were quite large, and they had photographed. We never saw nor heard anything else regarding this Bigfoot, and Tina had sold her home 6 months later, with us following suit the next year. After this event, we were afraid to go anywhere out of the house, and especially coming home after dark, which was impossible. I can't emphasize just how much this ordeal had shaken us up, but it did. Later asked Mike for some details of this creature, having seen it at close range a couple of times, and here's what he said to me. When I first saw the creature, in my mind it registered as a bear, but my heart told me otherwise. It was far too big and sitting much too high in the hindquarters. Really, I'd never seen anything like it, but it was on all fours and dark with fur. Fearing an attack and not really knowing what to do, I fired 2 successive rounds right at it. And that's when things got weird really quick. A bear would have either dropped or took off in a hurry, but this thing did neither. I'd squeezed off 2 rounds right after another, and this thing was already raising up and turning toward me. It stood up and turned so quickly in one fast movement. In a moment, I was caught off guard. That lasted for all of 2 seconds before I turned and ran while this beast had stood and turned and was already into its first step before I even moved. I didn't look back, but my assumption was that when I had bolted, it must not have followed me. I say this because I don't believe I would be here today if it had. Its first step in turning had to have been 6 feet or better, which told me it could have gotten me in lickety-split. And there would have been nothing I could have done about it. My gun was empty, and there would have been no way to defend myself against such a beast. My gut tells me that it was at least 8 feet tall and better than 1,000 pounds. It was so close when I fired that I could see the wrinkles in its face when it turned to face me. It had long arms and banana-like fingers with dark gray skin visible around its chest, face, and hands. The feet had overhanging hair on all sides, which gave the appearance of fringe hanging off of them. I wouldn't have believed it had someone else told me the story, but seeing is believing, and there is no doubt in my mind that I saw a Bigfoot that day. Whether anyone believes me or not, I don't care. Today's third part of the upload is a very interesting and old disappearance. That definitely has some cryptid ring to it. Jim Carter, 32, was with a 20-member climbing party from Seattle who were on Mount St. Helens in Washington in May of 1950. On the way down the mountain, he left the other climbers near a landmark called Dog's Head at around 8,000 feet. Carter was an experienced skier and mountaineer, and he told the rest of the climbers that he would ski around to the left and take some pictures of the group as they skied down the timberline. From here, Carter took off down the mountain in a wild, death-defying dash, apparently taking chances that no skier of his caliber would take. unless something was terribly wrong or he was being pursued. He apparently jumped over 2 or 3 large crevices and was going like a devil down the slope, seemingly frightened of something. That was the last time anyone saw Carter alive. Was his disappearance linked to the famous giant ape attack of 1924? Despite the large search of the area for weeks by experienced search and rescue teams, no trace of Carter was found. Only a discarded film box at the point where he had taken a picture was discovered. When Carter's tracks reached the steep side of Ape Canyon, the searchers were amazed to see that Carter had been in such a hurry that he went right down the steep canyon walls, but they didn't find him at the bottom of the canyon as they expected. The tracks were traced by plane again towards Eagle Creek Ranger Station before they disappeared into the complete wilderness. Carter's complete disappearance is an unsolved mystery to this day, declares Bob Lee, a member of the Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue Unit who was involved in the operation to find Carter. Lee was a very experienced Portland mountaineer, and his credentials included that he was a member of the exclusive Worldwide Alpine Club and the leader of the 1961 Himalayan expedition and advisor to the 63 American expedition. He said that every time he got cut off from the rest of the searchers during the long search, he got the feeling that something or somebody was watching him, and there was something strange on the high slopes of the mountain. He described the search as the most eerie experience I have ever had. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was terrifying. I was unarmed except for my ice axe, and believe me, I never let go of it. We combed the canyon, one end to the next, for 5 days. Sometimes there were as many as 75 people in a search party, but no sign of Carter or his equipment were found. Lee states after 2 weeks of the search, it was called off. 75 years later, and Jim's remains or equipment were never found. Ape Canyon is a gorge along the edge of the Plains of Abraham, on the southeast shoulder of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. The gorge narrows to a close as 8 feet at one point. Ape Canyon was heavily impacted by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it is near the steep rocky canyon as the present Ape Canyon Trail. On the south side of the mountain is another feature named Ape Cave. The canyon was reported the site of a violent encounter in 1924 between a group of miners and with several ape men or Sasquatch in 1924. An event later incorporated into a Bigfoot folklore. These allegations were reported in July 16, 1924 issue of the Oregonian. Fred Beck, Gabe Lefebvre, John Preston, Marion Smith, and Smith's son Roy described coming upon a gorilla man near where they built a small cabin for their gold mining trips. They claimed they were 8 miles from Spirit Lake when they encountered 4 of these giant creatures moving through the forest, erect, human-like strides. They're covered with long black hair. Their ears are about 4 inches long and 6 straight up. They have 4 toes, short and stubby. The witnesses estimated each animal to weigh 400 pounds. Scared witless by these creatures, Fred Beck, or one of his companions, fired his rifle at one of them and struck it 3 times. The wounded creature then fell off a cliff, but that was not the end. That night, the men woke up when huge stones began to hit the outside of the cabin. Then they heard and felt giant bodies slamming against the walls and the door before tearing a hole in the roof, allowing them to target Beck. 2 of the rocks struck Beck, one of them rendering him unconscious for 2 hours. Finally, after an uncomfortable and frightening night in the cabin, the sun rose and the attackers disappeared. The men ran for their lives. Rangers J.H. Huffman and William Walsh hiked into the forest with Beck, who took them to the cliff where he said the wounded ape creature was shot. They found nothing. They then continued on to the cabin, and Beck pointed out large stones that had been used in the attack. Huffman and Walsh weren't impressed, concluding that the gold prospectors had probably placed the large stones there themselves and faked the story. An Oregonian reporter asked the Rangers about the 14-inch long footprints found near the cabin. They responded that they believed the gold prospectors had made them themselves. But friends of the men reported they believed the story and that they actually saw something which they cannot explain. William Halliday, the director of the Western Speleological Survey, claimed that in his 1983 pamphlet, Ape Cave and the Mount St. Helens Apes, that the miners' attackers were actually local youths. Until the eruption of Mount St. Helens, counselors from the YMCA camp on the nearby Spirit Lake brought hikers to the canyon's edge and related the tradition that the 1924 incident was actually the result of young campers throwing light pumice stones into the canyon, not realizing there were miners at the bottom. Looking up, the miners would have only seen dark, moonlit figures throwing stones at their cabin. The narrow walls of the canyon would have served as a distort the voices of the YMCA campers enough to frighten the men below. Did anyone catch what I caught in that story? Because I think there was some misidentification in that story, and if you go back and listen or remember, the description of what these ape-like creatures. Now, it's kind of strange that there's Ape Cave, Ape Canyon, but then there is Dog Head. It's kind of strange right there, but the description of the creature is even more baffling and almost sounds like a dogman or werewolf to me. They are covered with long black fur. Their ears are about 4 inches long and sticking straight up. They have 4 toes, short and stubby. The witnesses estimated each animal to weigh 400 pounds. That sounds more like a werewolf or dogman than a Sasquatch to me. How about you guys? Today's final encounter comes to us from the great state of Nebraska. My family was born and bred as farmers, generationally going back 150 years in this great state. We have land holdings that reach far and wide, growing both corn and soybean, and I've been a part of it for some 55 years to the date. My 2 sons, who were at the time 11 and 14, had come home after riding their 4-wheelers through the fields. The 2 of them had come busting through the back door, screaming and jabbering one over the other about having seen some type of creature in the standing corn. Now, the field of which they were speaking had not been turned under as of yet, so it was comprised of standing, dried-out corn stalk, and they were talking about hundreds of acres of standing stalk. After I'd calmed them down, I asked my oldest to tell me what had happened. He said that he and his brother were riding through the southeast field when this huge dog emerged from the corn ahead of them. The 2 of them had backed off the throttle as this creature was facing them at about 50 yards distance, hunched down on its front paws, with its fangs exposed and snarling. He then went on to say that the dog's eyes in broad daylight were glowing bright red and twinkling. I looked at the 2 of them, knowing that they were good boys and not prone to lying or spinning tales, and they were both visibly shook up about what they had seen. It was then my youngest, who was a real jabberjaw of the 2, started to chime in, saying how big it was. He said its hindquarters were hunched down, and it was a good 4 feet to the ground, and its body was about 20 inches wide. Now, we have nothing in the area which can remotely fit this description, and I personally know everyone in the surrounding areas as well, and all of their hounds and animals, and nobody owns anything which would fit the bill of what my sons were talking about. During the week which followed, I was extremely busy doing much needed maintenance around the farm and on the equipment, as well as a lot of paperwork. But even in my business, I'd realized the boys hadn't fired up their four-wheelers once, and this was their passion, in particular this time of year. So, having put aside much of my work, I asked my sons to take a ride with me out to where they had seen this dog-like creature. For up until that point, I hadn't done so, and I wanted to put the thing to rest one way or another. I took my shotgun and Cole on one of the quads. My eldest took the lead on the other, and we rode down to the southeast field together. Arnold had stopped, and when I asked him if this was the spot, he said, "No, it's over there, Dad." In other words, he didn't even want to ride close to where they had seen this creature. That's how frightened he still was over what they had seen. So the three of us got off the four-wheelers, and I, of course, was toting a side-by-side, and walked slowly over to the area. As soon as Cole said that's where it came out of, my eyes were drawn immediately to numerous prints in the soil, which were definitely from some type of canine and about 5 inches wide. These were bigger than any dog print I had ever seen, and there had never been reports of any wolves for as long as I was alive. Now I knew that my boys were telling the truth, and to be honest with you, I hadn't doubted what they saw. I was just wondering, as a parent would do, if they had misidentified what they saw. I'm going to fast forward here several months later, prior to which I had spoken personally to every one of my neighbors. None of them had seen anything like what my sons had described on their land. All of these men, by the way, were regularly out on their properties in tractors and trucks taking care of their business. And I had thought surely someone would have seen something, but none of them have. We had about a dozen cats on our property, all of which lived in the barn, and their job was to keep field mice and such down to a low roar. Each one of them being named by the family. My wife, Lisa, was talking during dinner one evening, and she said she hadn't seen Herman in a while and thought he had died. Don't ask me why the cat's name was Herman. I didn't name any of them, but it was. The next day I was riding down into the southwest corner of the property in my truck when, for whatever reason, something caught my eye on the ground, which caused me to stop and get out. Lying in front of me on the ground was the gray head of Herman the cat. I could tell just by looking at it that it had been torn off the body, not cleanly bitten off. I should also mention that never at any time in the past had any of our animals been found dead on our land. We had found skeletal remains of cats that had wandered off to die in the field, but never anything the likes of what I saw. In that moment, a dark and eerie feeling began to take hold of me, which I had never experienced before on my land. I began to feel like I was being watched, and I became very uncomfortable. I went back to the house and told no one about my finding. Days later, while working in the barn, my wife came out and said, "Honey, is everything okay? You haven't been yourself lately." At that point, I told her what I had seen. 4 days later, after the sun had long been set for the day, my shepherd began to bark as I walked to the back door and opened it. There was very unusual behavior for my dog. He's going nuts. My shepherd weighed a good 125 pounds, and as I looked out, I could see him in the outline of another animal, which appeared to be another dog or a wolf running in the darkness. It was at least 3 or 4 times his size. I went inside and grabbed his leash and my gun, and everyone was asking me, "What's wrong, Daddy?" But I told them to stay inside. Arnie, being the oldest, showed his young manhood by grabbing his .22 caliber rifle, stepping out with me, which made me proud of him. The two of us, with our guns and flashlights in hand, made our way over to where I had just seen this thing dart away, and my dog would go no closer. Pulling on his leash, dragging me away from the area, I tethered my dog. Arnie and I walked over together. Once again, looking down on the ground, there was these enormous canine prints, just like the ones I had seen in the field. This was the first time in all of my years being here that I had seen any type of predator evidence on my home. For the first time in my life, I was fearing for my family's safety. Anything that big could easily kill a human or any other animal. I was scared and worried. Since now I knew that this creature was in fact coming near my home, I had decided to thaw out some venison from my meat freezer in an effort to bait and shoot the creature. I elevated the motion detector on my rear light to hopefully pick up anything further out in the yard, which had previously been angled to catch the truck pulling up. I began setting my baits. For 2 weeks, I set fresh bait intermittently, and I was sleeping in my recliner by the rear bay window facing the outside, hoping the light would come on and wake me up, which it did. It was a Thursday night, 2 a.m, when I woke. As I gathered my thoughts, I immediately peered through the glass, and there it was. I can only describe it as a hound from hell, leaning over the meat in the dim light. Every time it lifted its head between bites, the light hit its eyes, and they were luminescent, red, and wide set. The head on this thing must have been nearly a foot wide at the back of its jaw, and its white fangs jutted up and down in its mouth. As I tried to make my way out of the recliner and grab my gun, the monster's eyes were suddenly fixed in my direction. Seconds later, it dipped its head back down to take another bite. I stood up and grabbed my gun. As soon as I grabbed it, the creature lurched its head forward and started to turn in a manner which told me that I had been found out. For whatever reason, in the heat of the moment, thinking that all my hard work would be for naught, should this thing turn and run, I shoved the barrel of my shotgun right through the pane of glass and pulled the trigger. This was strictly a point-and-shoot, all-for-nothing gamble on my part, and as the shot rang out, I saw the hindquarters of this creature lift off in the air, having been hit by my load. It jumped in kind of a gimpy movement, indicating to me that I had damaged its leg, and it moved off into the darkness. The whole household woke up by the ordeal, and we spent the entire night looking out into the backyard. Next morning, as soon as it was light enough for me to see, I walked out by the bait and saw blood on the ground. In the days and weeks to come, I was unable to locate the body of this beast, even with assistance from the neighbors. It wasn't until many months later that my friend ran across the skeleton while turning his field under and called me to come over and have a look. It was a massive skeleton of a huge canine with some of the fur still attached. It measured close to 6 feet from the tip of its snout back to its... It was enormous. I would have to say that based on the skeleton of this creature, it would have weighed several 100 pounds. None of us had any idea of what to do with it, what it was, where it came from, but we were sure this was the animal that I had shot. There was actually lead stuck in the hind leg of it, and the same leg seemed to have been damaged, more than likely by the shot. I'd never seen anything with glowing, wide-set red eyes prior to this event, nor have I since. What was this? I had no idea, but I just wanted to share it with everyone. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed today's upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. You know, recording is my favorite part of the day. I just want to share this with you really quick. So I have a very simple life. I usually spend the evenings researching, reading, looking at old files, new files, watch a little bit of YouTube videos, non-cryptid related, because my brain is full of cryptid stuff anyway, because I've got it in front of me while I'm watching YouTube videos. Usually I'm watching 3-wheeler or 4-wheeler racing or just something stupid. Go to bed, get up. My daughter does her homeschooling. I upload during that time. And then I carry on with my day. Usually a little more research. Go check on my mom and dad. Come home, make dinner. And then my favorite part of the day is recording. It just something about this time of the day or night just makes me feel happy. Like, I'm so happy with my life when I'm, hanging out with my daughters, doing stuff with them. But it's a different happiness when I'm working on the channel. It's a happiness of doing something, of actually trying to make a difference, trying to come to some sort of answer with you guys. Not for you, but with you. I get emails all the time from you guys, and I love it. I really do. I'm going to be actually interviewing somebody a little bit later tonight and share what they saw in New York as well. Not in my neck of the woods, but a little southwest from me. Well, a lot southwest from me. But yeah, this channel and you guys and your support make my life worth it, I guess. My kids do, excuse me. Don't get me wrong. But, I don't need anything else in my life except my kids and this channel and you good people. So thank you. You guys really make a difference in my life, and I appreciate that. I just wanted to share that with you because y'all mean so much to me. And, when I do get a dislike or a negative comment, I laugh it off, or I'm usually a little rude back. Like, I try to play like it doesn't bother me, but it does. Because I'm not trying to become famous or rich or anything. I don't care about that. This is something that I love doing. So, with that, I want to bid you farewell. Please be kind to each other, and may the Great Spirit watch over you and guide you through your path of life. And with that, see ya!